Ai, acho que vou me mudar.
Okay, so we are pleased to have here Professor Jonathan Berg from the University of Haifa, and here's a correction. I said that he is originally from New York, but only in the sense of biological origin, because he grew up in California. So he's actually in California.
I'm glad you got that straight. So first of all, I'm very thankful to Marco for making it possible for me to be here after having had such a great time in Curitiba. And I'm also thankful to those of you who heard my first talk in Curitiba that you're allowing me to demand more of your philosophical attention. That's something else. Right, omitting needless words is what I want to talk about. Jason Stanley wrote in this paper of his Context and Logical Form, he wrote, "My purpose in this paper is to defend the thesis that all truth-conditional effects of extra-linguistic context can be traced to logical form." In the same paper he wrote, "Suppose my principal claim is true, that all effects of extra-linguistic context on the truth conditions of insertion are traceable to logical form." He also wrote in the same paper, "I've defended the thesis that all effects of extra-linguistic context are traceable to logical form." And he also concluded, "The central purpose in this paper has been to explain and defend the thesis that all truth-conditional effects of context are traceable to logical form." Well, what's his thesis? We have on the face of it 4 candidates. All truth-conditional effects of extra-linguistic context can be traced to logical form. All effects of extra-linguistic context on the truth conditions of insertion are traceable to logical form. All effects of extra-linguistic context are traceable to logical form. All truth-conditional effects of context are traceable to logical form. Question. Assuming there is a unique proposition T, which is Stanley's thesis, and which he means to express in each of these formulations, is T what he says in each of these formulations? Okay, we see there are slightly different formulations. So I'm raising a question about what he is saying in each of, let's say, for the sake of argument, let's say that he would assert all 4 of these sentences. Right? Is he saying the same thing? And I'm assuming that there is one proposition that he means when he asserts all these things. So that's one question. He apparently thinks yes, or at least he ought to think yes if he's not going to be hypocritical. I think no. I think he's saying different things. And another question is a sort of subsidiary question, although it gets mixed into these discussions. Which answer is more intuitive? And there's also a question about why bother asking these questions, which I hope to get to.
Jonathan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is number 3 exactly? There's nothing about truth conditions in number 3. I wonder if you just misspoke there, or did you get it? Did you get it exactly? That's what he said.
It may well be that oh, sorry. Okay. What did he say? All effects of extra-linguistic context.
Okay.
All effects.
Yeah, that's clearly not going to be the same.
That's certainly not what he thinks.
Well, when I say everybody came to the party. Anyway, we'll get to that. We're running out. Right. So assuming that there's one proposition that that's his thesis and that's what he means when he says all these things, let's suppose all that. So the question I'm asking is one of those difficult questions about what's said. Whether he's saying that same proposition in all of these utterances. Right. So another way to think about the issue, a little less amusing, but maybe a little more to the point. when I see Sharon later and she asks me how the talk went, I might say, well, everybody listened enthusiastically. I might say that. Of course, what I meant is not that everybody in the whole wide world listened enthusiastically, but something like everybody who came to my talk today listened enthusiastically. So there's a question about what I said, all right? There's no argument here about the sentence that I uttered, and there's no argument here about what I meant, okay? I uttered the shorter sentence, and I meant that restricted generalization that everybody who came to my talk today listened enthusiastically. We're assuming that's what I meant when I uttered the shorter sentence. Here's two different views about what's going on. What I call the expansion view says that what is said is the restricted generalization expressed by the expanded sentence. Okay? So according to the expansion view, even though I only uttered the words, everybody listened enthusiastically, I actually said that everybody who came to my talk today listened enthusiastically. Okay, that's the expansion view. The explicit view, on the other hand, says that what's said in this case is the unrestricted generalization explicitly formulated in a short sentence. That when I uttered the words, everybody listened enthusiastically, what I said was that everybody listened enthusiastically, okay, without the qualification. So there's an argument about whether this extra qualification on the quantifier is part of what I actually said or not. That's the issue here. And Jason Stanley and I have very different ideas. Well, we give the different answers. He gives the expansion view, and I take the explicit view. Right? That's just so you know where. Okay, truth in advertising. The explicit view is the right one. This comes because we have very different pictures about the basic concepts here. What Jason Stanley says is, first of all, there's what's articulated, which he calls the phonological sentence. What's articulated is the string of words that you actually say, like, everybody listened enthusiastically. Okay, that's why he calls it a phonological sentence. That's what you actually hear. Those are the sounds the guy makes. He says, this is a little dicey. He says that every phonological sentence is associated with a grammatical sentence, and that's what's uttered. Okay, so there's the phonological sentence, that's the one you actually hear, that he says is articulated. There is also this thing, the grammatical sentence, which is what's uttered. The grammatical sentence, linguists often call this logical form. The grammatical sentence may include various elements that weren't articulated, that weren't, there aren't words for them in the phonological sentence. Okay, so it can include extra stuff in it, like qualifying phrases on quantifiers. So there's the phonological sentence, that's what's articulated, that's what you actually hear. There's this grammatical sentence, which is a bit more of a theoretical posit, which is uttered, and it expresses what's said. Okay, the proposition that's what's said, when a proposition is being said, is not what's expressed, it's not what's expressed directly by the phonological sentence that's articulated, but it's what's expressed by the grammatical sentence that's uttered, that's associated with the phonological sentence that's articulated. Okay, that's roughly the picture. I don't want to spend a lot of time getting into the details of his position because they get really, really complicated, and I don't think we need it for our discussion now. Different picture. My picture is that what's said includes, roughly, only the semantic contents of the words actually pronounced. Okay, so if you don't actually pronounce a word, like, who came to my talk today, if I don't actually pronounce today, then today doesn't get into the proposition that's said on my view. But it is convenient to omit needless words, which can be surmised by the listener, so we often utter only a fragment of a sentence that expresses the proposition we wish to convey. Hence the title of the talk. There's a wonderful book called Elements of Style. If you don't know this, you must get it. Elements of Style by Strunk, and more recently also White. This is a very little book about how to write. And it's an extremely well-known book in American universities and colleges where students typically have to take some kind of course about how to write, and very often this is the textbook. It's a very short book. It's a very pithy book. I really regret the fact that there isn't, in Hebrew, I teach in Israel, and in Hebrew there isn't any book like that. In fact, there isn't any sort of way of thinking like that about writing. I think it's an American thing. Strunk and White afterwards. White was a student, actually. White is an essayist. He was a student of Strunk's, and afterwards he wrote a newer edition of the book. Anyway, the book makes a big deal about writing clearly and concisely, okay? Which is why, as philosophers, it's a wonderful book to use to help your students understand how to write. And in particular, Strunk has this section where he's giving some rules, and one of the rules is omit needless words. And White says he remembers when he was a student sitting in the class, Strunk would get to this. And he'd say, okay, rule number 7, omit needless words. Omit needless words. Okay? I mean, you can, if you want to repeat it, but don't just throw in a bunch of extra words that you don't need. It would be really nice if you stuck to those rules. So anyway, I think a lot of times we omit needless words for various reasons, but that's quite apart from what's being said or not said. Okay, so there are these two different pictures, which I think are behind Stanley's answer and my answer, behind the expansion view and the explicit view. And oh yeah, I should throw in. I mean, part of the reason why I have the picture that I have and not Stanley's is because I think it's important to recognize that eventually we're going to need a theory anyway to explain how we interpret utterances containing expressions that were unheard, misheard, or misspoken. Right? Sometimes somebody's talking to you, especially like on a cell phone, right, and you don't hear one of the words, or you don't hear one of the phrases, or you hear it wrong. You thought he said one word and he said a different word. Or he actually chose the wrong word and wound up saying something other than, well, I would say he wound up saying something other than what he meant to say. But something that you can't really do that. I think we're going to have some kind of theory for that in the big picture. And I want to connect that to what goes on in these cases where there are intended restrictions on a quantifier that aren't literally expressed. Okay, so there are these two pictures, there are these two views. And what happens, what's been happening for years and years, is that the guys on the expansion side seem to take the high road with regard to intuitions. They think, obviously, their position is much more in keeping with our simple intuitions about what's being said on various occasions. So Stanley says something like this: the obvious disadvantage of pragmatic approaches, such as I advocate, to unarticulated domain restrictions, is that one has to abandon ordinary intuitions concerning the truth or falsity of most sentences containing quantifiers. Right? He's saying, if you take my view, that when I said everybody listened enthusiastically, what I said was everybody listened enthusiastically. That's what you think. Then he says you have to abandon all kinds of ordinary intuitions about the truth or falsity of most sentences and quantifiers. He says elsewhere, I want to argue in favor of the view that all the constituents of the propositions hearers would intuitively believe to be expressed by utterances are the result of assigning values to the elements of the sentence uttered, not articulated, The sentence uttered is this other posited logical form or something like that. The results of the sentence, sorry, I want to argue in favor of the view that all the constituents of the propositions hearers would intuitively believe to express by utterances are the result of assigning values to the elements of the sentence uttered and combining them in accord with its structure.
Sorry, this second quotation is from context and logical form, or what is the second quotation from?
All these quotations are from his anthology of essays.
The anthology.
I forgot what it's called. So there's like half a dozen different papers in there, and I didn't always mention which paper it was. I'm sorry. And Robin Karsten says the in her wonderfully direct way, implicature analysis rides roughshod across strong intuitions. So why do they say this? Well, let's understand better how the explicit view that I advocate rides roughshod over intuitions. Well, I claim that whenever people say it's raining, period, what they are saying is almost certainly true. And almost certainly not what they need to say. What they are saying is just that it's raining, which only requires that somewhere in the universe it's raining. Not that it's raining at this particular point, or it's raining where I am, or it's raining where you are, or at the sailing position or something like that. And according to the explicit view, whenever people say, everybody came to the party, or everybody did this or that, or everybody was parking on the other side of the street, what they are saying is almost certainly false, and not what they mean to say, because what they're saying is simply that everybody did this, and they obviously mean that only everybody of some certain group. And according to my view, because of this, it's often the case, maybe usually it is, we seldom actually say what we mean. There's usually a big gap between the semantic comments of the words that we actually utter and what we mean. We often say things that are patently false, like everybody came to the party, or everybody was driving too fast. But we often say things that are trivially true, like it's raining. So, in the example about the talk, I say the sentence, everybody listened enthusiastically. I mean by this that everybody who came to my talk today listened enthusiastically. But according to the explicit view, all I said was everybody, the whole universe, listened enthusiastically. Okay, so that's why expansionists tend to think that the explicit view rides roughshod over our intuitions. These look like unintuitive results. There's also another reason why the expansionists claim that they've got intuitions on their side, and that has to do with appeal to indirect discourse reports. So Scott Soames gives this example of where he says the sentence, I am Scott Soames, thereby meaning and conveying that his name is Scott Soames. Okay, now I actually agree with him that the first proposition, the first sentence expresses a different proposition than the second sentence. The first sentence expresses a proposition in the form A equals A. Right? It says of a certain thing that it is identical to that thing. The second sentence expresses a relation that holds between an object and a name. It's talking about a name. It's talking about a mirror relation. So Soames will agree about that. But nevertheless, he insists that when he says, I am Scott Soames, he is asserting or saying that his name, among other things, that his name is, quote, Scott Soames. How does he justify this? He says, well, look, it's going to be perfectly natural. Suppose somebody watched this conversation, okay? Soames walks into the room and says to me, hi, I am Scott Soames. And somebody asks me, what did he say? and I say, he told me that his name was Scott Soames. Okay? That seems like a perfectly acceptable way to talk. And therefore, one might conclude that what I actually said in that direct report, when I said he told me blah, 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 or he said that his name was Scott Soames, since that's such a natural way to talk, you might assume that, okay, so that's what he said. What he said was that his name is, quote, Scott Soames. Right? If we take this clearly acceptable indirect discourse report at face value, then it supports the extensions here. In other words, taking the explicit view that I take, I want to say when he says, I am Scott Soames, he doesn't say anything about names at all. He just says that he's Scott Soames, and it's something that's trivially true, right? Because every object is self-identical. So what about this indirect discourse report? It's natural to say, he said his name is Scott Soames. But I deny that that report is actually true. I think it's just a different way of talking. Okay, so what I want to do now, having established what the argument is about and why the other guys with the extensions view think that the explicit view that I favor is unintuitive, I want to take a closer look at this issue about what's intuitive and what isn't. Okay, second thoughts about what's intuitive. And I want to consider several issues here. And first of all, what I want to show is that even though it might seem most intuitive under this situation to report that he said that his name was Scott Soames, nevertheless, I think that maybe what seems intuitive might change if we consider certain aspects of the situation. Sure, when he said the words, I am Scott Soames, he clearly meant that his name was Scott Soames. There's no question here about what he meant. I will grant that that's what he meant. And if this speaker here, instead of saying he told me that his name was Scott Soames, if he had said, he uttered a sentence with the intention of conveying the proposition that his name is Scott Soames, fine, no problem. Okay? With regard to what he meant, no question. The question is whether what he meant, this proposition about his name, is what he actually said. When he uttered the words, I am Scott Soames, did he actually say that his name was Scott Soames? In fact, did he say anything at all about his name? Okay, according to Jason Stanley, yes. But that seems to me very unintuitive. I think that in that situation, he's actually saying something about his name. Oops, sorry. Oh no, where are you? Okay. Sorry. Right. Or take the other example about the talk. I could say, sure, when I said the words, everybody listened enthusiastically, I clearly meant only that everybody who came to my talk today listened enthusiastically. Okay, no argument, there's no question here about what I meant. Both sides agree on that. The question is whether what I meant is what I actually said. When I uttered the words, everybody listened enthusiastically, was all I actually said just that everybody who came to my talk today listened enthusiastically? In fact, did I say anything at all about coming to my talk when I said everybody listened enthusiastically? I don't think so. I think it's very unintuitive to think that I said anything about my talk. So I think our ideas about what's intuitive might change if we push certain aspects of the situation. Now, there's a problem here that often arises when people are talking about what's said. There are problems with assessing intuitions and trying to draw conclusions from intuitions about what's said. Part of this is because the way we use this expression, what's said, is sort of ambiguous, right? Sometimes, one way you could use this expression, I don't know if it's like this in Portuguese, but I would be very surprised if it isn't. Sometimes when you use the expression what's said, what you're talking about are words that are pronounced, right? Say these words, okay? Blah, 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 blah. He said blah, 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 blah. On the other hand, sometimes what you're talking about when you say what you're talking about, what's said, could be, as David Kaplan would say, characters of proposition of sentences, or contents of sentences. If you take an example like, I can say, I am hungry now. And I can say again, I am hungry now. Okay? Did I say the same thing or did I say something different? Well, both times I said the same words, so if we're talking about words, I said the same thing. Right? Both times I use expressions that have the same characters. If you know what I'm talking about, fine. If you don't, never mind. Did I assert the same proposition both times? No, the first time when I said I'm hungry now, I was talking about that moment now when I said it, right? And when I say it at a later time, even though I'm saying the same words with the same character, I'm speaking at a different time. Now it picks out a different time, so I'm picking up different propositions, right? So we can see that as an example of how, on the one hand, we're saying the same thing on the other hand not. And there are lots of other kinds of examples that we can come up with that will separate between these. But what I want to look at is a different problem with intuitions about what's said. And that has to do with the distinction between speaking strictly and speaking loosely. Okay, so I'm going to concentrate on that a little bit. Let me give you some examples. I might utter the words, I paid 100 reais for it, meaning that I paid approximately 100 reais for it, right? Let's say I paid 99 reais. You know, it wouldn't be right for somebody later to come and say, no, you didn't pay 100, you only paid 99. It was a situation where it was clear that I was rounding off and blah, blah, blah. Okay. So I want to say this is an example of speaking loosely. I uttered the words, I paid 100 reais for it. That's not exactly what I meant. What I meant really is I paid approximately 100 reais for it. But I didn't want to bother putting in the word approximately. I omitted it. I might utter the words, Michael lives in London, when I mean Michael lives in the London metropolitan area. Okay? But it's a little bit cumbersome saying in the London metropolitan area. So to speak loosely, I just say Michael lives in London. I might say everybody at Jack's wedding got drunk. When I don't mean every single person at Jack's wedding got drunk, but almost everybody at Jack's wedding got drunk. I didn't mention the almost, I was just speaking loosely. I might say Daisy saw a unicorn, even though I know that there aren't any unicorns, so she couldn't have seen it. What I really meant was, it seemed to Daisy as if she saw a unicorn. But speaking loosely, I'm just saying Daisy saw a unicorn. Likewise, in indirect discourse, when we're talking about what somebody said, there's room for a distinction between speaking strictly and speaking loosely. Okay, so where Soames utters the sentence, I am Scott Soames, meaning that his name is, quote, Scott Soames, this report, he said his name is Scott Soames. I want to say that this is loose talk. This is speaking loosely, just like those other cases where I leave out the approximately or the metropolitan area and so on. So too, I want to say that in this case, I might say he said his name is Scott Soames because I'm speaking loosely. If I wanted to speak strictly, I would have said something like, he uttered a sentence meaning thereby to convey the proposition that his name is Scott Soames. Okay? Talking like that is something that we do when we engage in philosophical discussion, but we don't normally do it in normal talk. When I say to Sharon later, everybody listened enthusiastically, meaning everybody who came to my talk today listened enthusiastically. Are you still listening enthusiastically? One might report, he said that everybody listened enthusiastically. And the listener might say, what, everybody? And so the listener might correct this, say, he said that everybody who came to his talk listened enthusiastically. So I think even in indirect discourse, there's a distinction that's important to make between speaking loosely and speaking strictly. More specifically, I propose as follows. When somebody asserts something of the form, he said that P, there are these loose uses in a couple of different ways. It could be, he said loosely that P. He might have not actually said it. He might have hinted it. He might have indicated it somehow. I'm sorry. He said loosely that P. He might not have said exactly P, but he might have said something that loosely we could formulate as P. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that he merely spoke with the intention of thereby conveying the message that P. In other words, the looseness might not actually be in the formulation of P, but rather in this kind of looseness about whether he actually said it or only meant it, and so on. I want to contrast these with what I consider the strict use of an indirect discourse report. When you say he said that P, strictly speaking, what it means is he explicitly and literally said exactly that P. Okay, so if there were some qualifications in there on quantifiers, they've got to be there, and so on. Okay, so given this distinction that we can make between loose indirect discourse reports and strict indirect discourse reports, what does that give us with regard to this question about intuitions and whether one side or another gets the intuitions about indirect discourse reports better? Well, let's look back at this case where Soames says, I'm Scott Soames. He means that his name is Scott Soames. And somebody reports this saying, he said his name is Scott Soames. Let's ask, is that exactly what he literally and explicitly said? Or in the case where I say everybody listened enthusiastically, meaning everybody who came to my talk today listened enthusiastically, and somebody reports me by saying, he said that everybody who came to his talk listened enthusiastically. Well, is that exactly what I literally and explicitly said? That everybody who came to my talk listened enthusiastically? Did I say that exactly, literally what I said? The words I uttered were everybody listened enthusiastically. Okay, so I think for those reasons, sort of like the previous batch, what might initially look like cases where intuitions favor the expansion view seem to be cases where intuitions don't favor the expansion view, as long as we take more into account. Here's another different sort of case where intuitions might not be what they first appear to be. And this is great. This actually happened. I'm not making this up. And it happened, of all people, it happened with Robin Karsten. We were arranging a time to meet. And at a certain point in this email interchange, it more or less gets settled, and she sends me an email that says, okay, I'll meet you at 4 p.m. Now, this was at the beginning of the week, okay? And for various reasons that have to do with the context, I know that what she meant was, she'll meet me at 4 p.m. British Standard Time this coming Friday, okay? Not any other day. But if I get an email and somebody says, I'll meet you at 4 p.m., and let's say I read that email and it's in the morning, okay? I might interpret that as by saying that she said she'll meet me at 4 p.m. British Standard Time today, right? Instead of interpreting it as 4 o'clock this coming Friday. I might interpret it as 4 o'clock today. Those are two plausible interpretations of an utterance in the sentence, I'll meet you at 4 p.m. Now, I actually didn't get it right. I, in fact, thought that she meant Friday, and I, in fact, thought that she meant the same day. Okay? I was confused. I didn't know what she actually meant. So the question arises, why was I confused? How can we account for this? I would say, I'm holding the explicit view, I can easily say, that I was confused because all she said was that she'll meet me at 4 p.m. But she didn't say which day. She didn't say that she'll meet me at 4 p.m. on Friday. She just said, I'll meet you at 4 p.m., so she didn't say which day. That's what I would say. I think that's a very intuitive account of what's going on. What would Stanley say? Well, he could say something like, let's see. She said which day she was going to meet you, she just didn't articulate it. That doesn't sound to me like it's more intuitive. In fact, on that account, I didn't know what she said. Okay? Here she is. She says, I'll meet you at 4 p.m. And I think, oh, okay. She said that she's going to meet me at 4 p.m. She didn't say which day, but it's in such and such a context, so I think she meant Wednesday.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't think it's intuitive to think that someone would just say that we'll meet you at a certain time if there isn't a day in discussion. Like,
there was a day in discussion, and the problem was that there were a couple of days that were in discussion to different degrees.
right, but
So it
at
wasn't
some point
clear.
you said, well, what she literally said was that she will meet me at 4 p.m., but every kind of interpretation will you give to this. I don't know if I'm following right, but every kind of interpretation you give to the sentence, you always will think about today, right?
You always will think,
We'll consider it a day.
you'll always have it. I think it's normal, yeah, when you say something like that, you have a day, I think, well, I can conceive of some weird ways, but yeah, you have a day in mind. And it's reasonable to suppose when somebody else says that person has a day in mind. But the question here is not about having something in mind or meaning something. The question is about what you say, okay? So she uttered the words, she emailed the words, I'll meet you at 4 p.m. Okay, I was confused because I was indeed assuming that she meant 4 p.m. on a certain day. Let me figure out, what day did she mean? I was confused. It could be that she meant on Friday, it could be that she meant on Wednesday. I had to figure it out. Why was I confused? A natural intuitive answer is, I was confused because all she said was, I'll meet you at 4 p.m. All she said was that she would meet me at 4 p.m., but she didn't say which day. Right? She obviously meant one day and not the other, but she didn't say it. Okay? On Stanley's view, she said it, but she didn't articulate it. Okay? She said it because when you take the sentence, I'll meet you at 4 p.m., okay? When you take that phonological sentence in this context, and you ask, okay, what's the grammatical sentence that was uttered as opposed to the phonological sentence that was merely articulated? What's the grammatical sentence that was uttered? Then other stuff gets in. So he'd have to say something like that, right? And it also has the consequence that when she wrote, I'll meet you at 4 p.m., I didn't know what she said. Because according to him, she said which day. Because she said she'll meet me at 4 p.m. on Friday. Because whatever she meant gets included in what she said. We can come back to this in discussion. Okay, here's a different one. Same example, okay, she says I'll meet you at 4 p.m. What she meant was she'll meet me at 4 p.m. British Standard Time this Friday. So consider these two sentences. I'll meet you at 4 p.m. and I'll meet you at 4 p.m. British Standard Time this Friday. would she have been saying just the same thing regardless of which of these two sentences she uttered? Okay, what she uttered was, I'll meet you at 4:30 p.m. Let's say, instead of that, she thought ahead and anticipated my confusion. And what she actually uttered was, I'll meet you at 4 p.m. British Standard Time this Friday. Okay? Did she, in both of these hypothetical situations, say the same thing? On my account, she did. I'm sorry, on my account, she didn't. Because in one case, she said this Friday. The other case, she didn't say it. Right? On Stanley's account, regardless of whether she says the shorter sentence or the longer sentence, she's saying the same thing. So it doesn't seem to me that he's got the edge there on intuitions. This is really the same as the piece that I opened with, right? We had these 4 different formulations of Stanley's thesis. And it's reasonable to suppose that he always meant to be saying the same thing. And he was just kind of speaking a little bit, writing a little bit loosely, right? Something that we usually try to teach our students not to do. He wasn't being too careful about getting in all the qualifiers and formulating it just exactly right, you know, like, I don't know, Bryce or somebody, possible way that we might get it wrong. On Stanley's account, I think, according to Stanley's position, he has to say that in all those different sentences, he was actually saying the very same thing. He was asserting the same proposition. He was saying the same thing. Whereas I want to say, well, he wasn't exactly saying the same thing. Yeah, loosely speaking, he was saying the same thing. Strictly speaking, no, he was saying slightly different things. And in fact, we all work pretty hard at distinguishing those slightly different things so that we can say strictly what we want to say. Yet another question with regard to which we might consider which position is more intuitive or not. And that has to do with choices that we make when we speak. Why is it that we usually use the shorter sentence instead of the expanded one? Okay, why do I say everybody listened enthusiastically instead of saying everybody who came to my talk today listened enthusiastically? Why would I use the shorter sentence instead of the longer one? Or why do we sometimes use an expanded sentence instead of the shorter one? Why is it that sometimes, instead of just saying, I'll meet you at 4 p.m., we say, I'll meet you at 4 p.m. this Friday? On the explicit view that I favor, it's because what was said might not be enough to understand what was meant. Right? We sometimes use the more expanded sentence because you recognize, if I just say, I'll meet you at 4 o'clock, you might not understand whether I mean 4 a.m. or 4 p.m., whether I mean today or tomorrow. So I might use a more expanded sentence. On the other hand, I might just say, I'll meet you at 4 instead of uttering everything because I might be omitting needless words. We seem to want to communicate efficiently. And there's some interesting psychological research about this, which you can ask me about in the discussion. It's very natural for us not to bother specifying explicitly things that we think are obvious to the speaker, things that we think are he's going to recognize anyway. And so it's more efficient, it's a lot easier just to say, I'll see you at 4, instead of saying, I'll see you at 4 o'clock standard time on such and such a day. But how could someone who favors the expansion view answer these questions? Why do we usually use the shorter sentence? Why do we sometimes use the bigger one? Well, I think what they have to do is say something like this, that it's because the words pronounced might not be enough for us to understand what was said. The words pronounced might not be enough to understand what was said. I to me that is not significant, or at least not as intuitive as the answer, as the previous answer that I gave. Now, part of what's going on here has to do with sort of deeper questions about what semantics is about, and what we're trying to do when we try to specify the truth conditions of a certain sentence or its logical form. Stanley's picture, and it's not just his, he's had different co-authors who have endorsed this view. Stanley says, look, accounting for our ordinary judgments about the truth conditions in various sentences is the central aim of semantics. These judgments are the data of semantic theorizing. Okay? Our ordinary judgments about the truth conditions in various sentences. So that means if Scott Soames walks in and says, hi, I'm Scott Soames, and we intuitively think that the truth conditions here are something about a name and this relation of bearing between the name and the person, then what semantics centrally has to do is account for that. So there's a kind of conception of semantics that you can call intuitive semantics, according to which the truth conditions yielded by semantic theory should match our ordinary judgments. What's said is what intuitively seems to be said. Okay, this is a line that's been pushed by a lot by Francois Recanati and relevance theorists like Karsten, and it's become more popular among all kinds of people who call themselves contextualists. Right, so according to this view, what semantics is about is mainly about what intuitively seems to be said. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And it's amazing. Stanley, I don't remember if it's in the paper with Szabo or the paper with King or just the introduction to the anthology. He really takes the view, he spells out very explicitly this view of what semanticists ought to be doing, right? Look at what intuitively people would say about a sentence, about what's being said. Okay? If intuitively they think that you're talking about a name, even though you didn't mention a name, or that you're talking about, all the people who came to the talk, even if you didn't mention the talk, if intuitively it seems that way, then what you need to do is beef up your grammatical theory so that the grammatical sentence will include reference to all of these other items that intuitively are part of the content of the utterance. Okay, so I want to mention a couple of objections to this. First objection, intuitions about what's said are diverse and even inconsistent. Native speakers, even tutored, reflective native speakers, often disagree. Right? So if you're going to say what semantics has to do is come up with theories about these kind of data, you have a problem in the fact that these data are not consistent. Even if we try to filter the data, get rid of a bunch of noise and so on, okay? So we won't ask our neighbor down at the bar what he thinks a certain sentence says. We'll just ask maybe our philosophical colleagues. Get tremendous diversity of opinion. I love this. Stanley says in another discussion, it is not the case that the intuitive truth conditions of 15 are what Recanati says they are. Okay? Recanati is saying intuitively this means blah, blah, blah. Right? And Stanley is telling, no, that's not what it means intuitively. Right? I mean, there's this explicit, profound disagreement about what's intuitive here. So it doesn't seem to me like a very good idea to base our semantic theories merely on the data about alleged intuitive truth conditions. Objection 2, which isn't exactly a different objection, sort of more developing the same objection. What I would rather claim about semantics is that, yeah, it's primarily concerned with truth conditions, but not our ordinary judgments about them. Accounting for our ordinary judgments about the truth conditions of various sentences is the job of an overall theory of communication, of which semantics is only one part. Semantic theories about what words mean must be coordinated with pragmatic theories about how words, given their meanings, are used. Okay, so I envisage for semantics a much more modest job. All that semantics has to do is say what words mean. There might be a gap between what words mean and the way people intuitively understand utterances of those words. Fine. You can't ignore that. That has to get explained. But I would expect the explanation of that to come in pragmatic theories about how we use the words, and not necessarily be reflected in semantic theories. Okay, so there are these different pictures of semantics, which I think are ultimately behind these different ideas about what's intuitive and what to make of these claims about intuitions. Okay, so remember, the original question was, assuming there's a unique proposition T, which is Stanley's thesis, in which he means to express in each of these formulations, is that what he says in each of those formulations? He says yes, I say no. And aside from the substantial disagreement, there's also this disagreement about which position is more intuitive. And so we've talked about that. What I haven't talked about yet is why bother asking? Why raise this question altogether? I mean, first of all, you might think, come on, it's just a matter of terminology. Okay? When you talk about what's said strictly and what's said loosely, okay, so what's said loosely, that's what he means when he talks about what's said, and there's just a kind of, we got to shift over a little bit our terminology on both sides, but it's not like there's anything here that's incommensurable. There's no real issue, it's not about what you call the stuff. One reason for thinking that the disagreement is only a matter of terminology is this passage from Stanley. He says, one example given by Stanley